the origin of all of this, I mean, even Lansmont, but it goes back Lansmont to MTS Monterey to MRL. Before that, Firestone Engineering Laboratory, which is an interesting story. I didn't live any of this. I heard about it and I've researched it a bit. So Leonard Firestone, son of the founder of Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. So Harvey was the dad. Back, I don't know, maybe turn of the 20th century or maybe even a little bit before. I mean, early days. Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. So that's Harvey. Leonard is the son. For some reason, unbeknownst to me or any of the research that I could do, he just became enamored with California. He loved California. He actually, Leonard, died in 1996 in his home on Pebble Beach on the Monterey Peninsula in California. He not only had a number of business ventures, but was very philanthropic in California, a lot of charity work and stuff like that. So one of his wild hairs was he founded a little outfit called Firestone Engineering Laboratory in Monterey, California. And I believe that's where the shock and vibration mitigation components for Polaris missiles came from. I think that's what Firestone Engineering Laboratory did. And I remember the MRL guys telling me about a machine that they called Old Yeller, which there was a movie from that era called Old Yeller about a dog, but I think they called it Old Yeller because the machine was painted yellow for some reason. They built this machine down on the wharf, on one of the wharfs in Monterey. I think they had to be near salt water or something for these tests. I'm not sure because I wasn't there. But this was a Firestone Engineering Laboratory thing. So that's, shock and vibration mitigation and maybe producing the shock pulses. So that was Firestone Engineering Laboratory, and Frank Bresk and Bob Gray were both involved in that. Well, after a while, I think Daddy might have pulled the plug, or the Firestone company pulled the plug on Leonard, because it was like a lark. That was my understanding. He loved California and he wanted to do some stuff, and Firestone went like, no, we're in the tire and rubber business. So this little engineering laboratory, which I think was just a handful of guys, really. Well, first Firestone wanted to sell it to Frank and Bob and whoever else was involved, but they didn't have any money. So they went looking for somebody to help them out. And I don't know how they came upon the connection, but it was to a company in Minneapolis or that area called Research Incorporated. And Research Incorporated, or RI, was kind of in the testing business. Well, they were, but their part of the testing business was thermal. So they made like little research ovens. So in if you're going to like pull a steel specimen apart to see how strong it is, well, if you want to see how strong it is when it's hot, you got to put an oven around it and then pull it apart, or, those kind of things. So not ovens for cooking food, but research ovens. And then of necessity, you got to get into the instrumentation, the way to accurately measure high temperatures and control gradients and stuff like that. So that was Research Incorporated's business. And for whatever reason, they bought out Firestone and created Monterey Research Laboratory with Frank Bresk as the president. So MRL started, and from their snubbers and motion arresters and stuff like that, got into shock machines. Pretty natural progression. And those guys were pretty good engineers. Bob Gray, however, was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And you got to realize this is back in the days when designs were done with drafting paper, pencils, and slide rules. And Bob was just a tremendous intuitive engineer. His mind, the way it worked was amazing. And so he was really the intelligence behind shock pulse programmers. And that was a big deal. This was the early days of Mill Standard 810. I don't know what the early publishing date was of 810 and then 810A. You know, what are we up to now? 810G or something after all these years. So this was the early days. And, you know, anybody in this business, you know that there's specified shock pulses. You got half sine pulses of specific amplitudes and durations, and it's got to be a shape that closely resembles a half of a sine wave. And sawtooth pulses, you know, these fast decay things, and Bob was just great at inventing programmers that would do that kind of thing. You could attach them to the table of a shock machine or put them on the base of a shock machine, have the table hit them, and the resultant would be these specified pulses. So that became their business. Half sines are pretty easy to program. You can do it with rubber pads, basically. And the way MRL started doing it was with shaped rubber pads, modules we used to call them. But Bob's contribution to that was, how can you make all these different pulses without having a specific design for every single pulse, every single table weight, every single specimen weight, all that sort of stuff. And Bob came up with these modules of elastomer pads that you could combine in various ways to cover this wide range of pulses that you needed to make. And, you know, we take that for granted these days. Like, well, of course you do that. Of course you put an eraser on the end of a pencil. Somebody had to be creative enough to come up with that. That was Bob Gray. And then he was the principal designer, although I think John came on later with MRL and was every bit as creative as Bob, but younger, so Bob mentored him. They came up with what MRL called the universal programmer. This was a single cylinder. It had these modular elastomer pads that went with it too. But this thing would produce sawtooth, half sine, and square wave pulses, all without having to turn yourself inside out to reconfigure the whole machine. And that was a patented device. I'm sure the patent has run out now, but that was a big deal. A subset of that was just an unlocking gas cylinder, which just made half sines and sawtooth, which were the primary Mill Standard 810 pulses of that day. When MRL started kind of falling on hard times, RI kind of realized that while they liked the money that MRL had been bringing in, they never really understood the business. And now that the money wasn't coming in so well, they were kind of getting disenchanted with this whole thing. Well, it turned out that in the history of RI, they had a little subgroup. Now remember, they were making research ovens, but they had a little subgroup that was getting involved in the machines that actually pulled these things apart. And that little subgroup had split off to form MTS Corporation. Well, now RI realized that, gee, MRL's business was really closer to this other one than it was to them. So they kind of were in the background and arranged making the sale to MTS, which on paper made perfect sense, but as I told you, we weren't very happy with them, so that's what caused Lance went. So, but the background with Firestone I always thought was sort of interesting.